You think it's connection, but it's actually inconsistency teaching your brain to crave what disappears. And once you understand how emotional distance can quietly create attraction, you stop chasing intensity and start questioning what it's really built on. Let's begin with something that often feels counterintuitive at first, yet becomes unmistakably clear once you recognize it. Emotional distance doesn't necessarily reduce attraction. In many situations, it actually amplifies it. People with an avoidant attachment pattern don't usually respond to closeness in the way most expect. Instead of moving closer when emotional depth increases, they tend to create space. That slight withdrawal, the shift from availability to distance, introduces a kind of psychological tension that the human mind is naturally sensitive to. Because attraction is rarely built on pure comfort. More often, it is fueled by anticipation, uncertainty, and the instinctive reaction to potential loss. When someone is steady, consistent, and emotionally open, your nervous system tends to settle. That is where trust and long-term stability can form. But when someone becomes harder to read, when their attention comes and goes, something different happens internally. Your mind starts working overtime. You begin analyzing tone, replaying conversations, searching for hidden meaning in small gestures. Thoughts about them increase, not because the bond is necessarily deeper, but because the situation feels unresolved. And the human brain struggles to ignore unfinished emotional loops. In that sense, avoidance can unintentionally intensify attachment. Their distance creates ambiguity, and ambiguity creates mental engagement. When there is no clear answer, the mind tries to generate one. It fills in gaps, assigns meaning, and builds narratives around limited information. As a result, you lean in more. You invest more energy, not always because the connection is stronger, but because it feels incomplete. And incomplete experiences tend to dominate mental space. There is another layer to this. When someone alternates between warmth and withdrawal, it activates the brain's reward system in a very specific way. It resembles the psychological pattern seen in unpredictable reward systems. When reinforcement is inconsistent, it becomes more compelling. The uncertainty itself keeps attention locked in. So, when an avoidant attachment individual shows closeness, it can feel intensified, almost magnified, but when they pull away, it doesn't register as simple distance. It registers as emotional loss, and loss carries a much heavier psychological weight than consistency ever could. However, what is often missed in this experience is that the intensity being felt does not always equal emotional depth. In many cases, it reflects scarcity. You are not only responding to the person themselves, but also to how infrequently they fully show up. Over time, rarity starts to feel like value, even when it is simply inconsistency. This is where perception begins to shift in subtle ways. The mind starts romanticizing uncertainty. Silence becomes interpreted as mystery. Independence is mistaken for strength. Emotional unavailability gets reframed as complexity or depth, but in reality, distance is not the same as depth. It is often just distance. Without awareness of this pattern, it becomes easy to confuse emotional activation with genuine compatibility. The feeling of chasing someone can be mistaken for the feeling of connection itself. This is why people often say they have never felt this way before. And in a sense, they are correct, but not always for the reasons they assume. What they are experiencing is heightened activation, a nervous system response driven by anticipation and unpredictability. It feels powerful, even consuming. But emotional intensity is not the same as emotional stability. This awareness introduces an important shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "Why am I so drawn to this person?" the more accurate question becomes, what kind of effect is this dynamic having on how I perceive them? Because once you recognize that emotional distance can generate desire, you stop treating intensity as proof of compatibility, and that realization changes how you interpret your own feelings. It allows you to see the difference between connection that is grounded and attachment that is being fueled by uncertainty. And as this understanding deepens, another layer becomes visible. Avoidant individuals don't just create distance, they often separate emotional intimacy from physical closeness in a way that most people do not naturally do. For them, physical presence and emotional vulnerability can exist independently. This means they may be fully engaged in moments of closeness, even passion, while still maintaining internal emotional boundaries. Outwardly, it can look like deep connection. Internally, it may not carry the same level of emotional exposure. For the other person involved, this creates confusion because most people naturally link physical closeness with emotional progression. The assumption is simple. If someone is close physically, they must also be opening up emotionally. But in this dynamic, that assumption doesn't always hold. An avoidant attachment style can experience intimacy without interpreting it as emotional surrender. They may feel present in the moment without feeling psychologically exposed. They can step into closeness and step back from it without the emotional residue that typically builds attachment in others. This is where misunderstanding often begins. Moments of eye contact, chemistry, shared energy, and emotional charge feel significant. The mind naturally builds meaning around them. It assumes direction. It assumes growth. It assumes emotional progression. But the internal experience on the other side may not match that interpretation. Emotional vulnerability can feel overwhelming, so instead of allowing both emotional and physical intimacy to deepen together, one is permitted while the other is held back. This creates an imbalance. One person begins to attach meaning to the connection while the other maintains emotional containment. One feels expansion, the other feels regulation. And in that gap, confusion slowly grows. At first, this dynamic can feel effortless, even exciting. There is no pressure, no heavy emotional demand, no defined expectation. It feels spontaneous and alive. But over time, a quiet question begins to surface. What is this actually becoming? This is often where people try to bridge the gap. They become more open, more emotionally available, hoping that increased depth will naturally inspire reciprocity. But avoidant attachment patterns typically do not respond that way. When emotional intensity increases, withdrawal often follows, not because there is no feeling, but because the feeling becomes harder to manage. This leads to a paradox. Moments of deep closeness exist alongside a limit that never fully dissolves. The connection feels real in fragments, but unstable in continuity. And without awareness of this pattern, it can easily be internalized. People may start believing they are asking for too much, or that this inconsistency is simply normal in relationships today. But the issue is not about wanting too much. It is about mutual capacity for intimacy. Because real connection is not defined by physical access alone. It is defined by emotional accessibility, being able to enter someone's inner world, not just their presence, their thoughts, their fears, their truth, their emotional reality. When physical closeness exists without emotional grounding, the experience can feel intense, but it rarely feels secure. That distinction matters more than most people initially realize. So the deeper question becomes, is this actual connection or simply proximity without emotional depth? Because the answer to that determines whether the experience evolves into something stable or remains something powerful only in moments, but inconsistent over time. And when this pattern continues, it doesn't just affect how you see the other person. It begins to shape how you interpret your own emotions as well. A slight delay in response, a shift in tone, a moment where emotional presence once felt steady suddenly becomes harder to access. The impact is immediate, even if nothing obvious has been said. The connection you were just responding to feels like it has subtly moved out of reach. Without realizing it, you've stepped into a cycle. This push-pull dynamic isn't random. It operates on a deeply psychological level, directly tied to how the human brain processes reward, attention, and attachment. When emotional connection is steady and predictable, the nervous system stabilizes. There is no urgency, no scanning, no emotional over-analysis. But when connection becomes inconsistent, something very different happens internally. The system activates. This is where intermittent reinforcement comes in. one of the most powerful conditioning mechanisms known in behavioral psychology. It's the same principle behind patterns that keep people mentally engaged in unpredictable reward environments. Because when you don't know when the next moment of closeness will arrive, your attention doesn't relax, it sharpens. You become more observant, more mentally involved. You start tracking shifts in behavior. You replay conversations. You analyze tone, timing, emotional cues. And slowly, your focus is no longer just on the person. It shifts toward the pattern itself. Did I say something wrong? Did I move too fast? Was that moment real or just temporary? And in that process, attachment begins to form not from consistent connection, but from contrast, from the difference between presence and withdrawal, between warmth and distance, between availability and absence. Because moments of closeness, when they are not guaranteed, begin to feel earned. And anything perceived as earned naturally increases in emotional value. So when the connection returns, and it usually does, it brings relief, sometimes even a surge of excitement. The brain interprets that return as reward, but what it is actually learning is the cycle itself, approach to withdrawal to return to repetition. And over time, that cycle becomes the structure of the connection. Here's the deeper layer most people miss. This pattern doesn't just intensify emotion, it reshapes perception. You stop evaluating the relationship based on stability and begin evaluating it based on emotional peaks, on its most intense moments, on its highest highs, and that becomes a dangerous reference point. Because any connection defined by spikes will almost always feel stronger than one defined by consistency, but feeling stronger is not the same as being healthier or more sustainable. At a philosophical level, this reveals a core tension in human nature. The conflict between stability and stimulation. We want safety, but we also want intensity. And when those two are misaligned, intensity often wins in the short term, even when it compromises clarity in the long term. So you remain inside the dynamic, not because it consistently meets your needs, but because it occasionally exceeds them in unforgettable ways. And those rare moments begin to justify everything that surrounds them. But the truth is simple. A healthy connection should not require emotional absence to create appreciation. It should not depend on withdrawal to generate value. And it should not repeatedly pull you into cycles of waiting just to feel present again, because when a relationship becomes a loop instead of a foundation, you are no longer building something stable, you are reacting to something unstable, and over time, that reaction starts to feel like attachment. This is where clarity becomes essential. The question is no longer, how do I get back to the high, but rather, why does the high only exist between the lows? Because once that question is asked honestly, the dynamic begins to lose its psychological grip. Emotional turbulence stops being mistaken for emotional depth. Intensity stops being confused with compatibility. And as this awareness develops, another layer begins to surface, one that is far more subtle. Because avoidance doesn't only create distance. In the beginning, it often creates something that feels like deep alignment. Especially early on, avoidant attachment patterns can be highly perceptive. They pick up on emotional tone, values, language, and energy with striking accuracy. Without necessarily intending to, they mirror it back in a way that feels deeply synchronized. You express curiosity, they match it. You show emotional depth, they reflect it. You open up, they seem to meet you there, sometimes even expanding the moment further. And in that phase, it doesn't feel like surface-level interaction. It feels like recognition, like being understood in a way that feels rare, even precise. That experience is powerful, because being understood sits at the core of human emotional need. When someone mirrors your internal world so accurately, your mind naturally builds meaning around it. This is connection. This is alignment. This is something worth investing in. But what often goes unnoticed is that mirroring is not the same as sustained emotional availability. It is responsiveness in the present moment, not necessarily stability across time. So what begins as attunement can quietly shift into inconsistency. The depth of engagement that felt natural starts to fluctuate. Conversations become less layered. Emotional presence becomes less reliable. What once felt effortless begins to feel conditional. And now your mind tries to solve the change. What happened? Did I misread it? Was it ever real? But a more grounded question often sits underneath all of that. Was it ever sustainable? Because mirroring without emotional consistency creates the illusion of connection without the structure needed to maintain it. It is reflection without foundation, and reflection by nature changes depending on context. This is why people often find themselves chasing not just the person, but the version of the person they experienced at the beginning. The version that felt fully aligned, fully present, fully open. And as that version fades, it doesn't lose importance. It gains it. The mind begins to idealize it, to reconstruct it, to hold it as proof of what could be restored if things just went back to how they were. But real connection is not measured by how deeply someone can meet you once. It is measured by how consistently they can remain present as complexity enters the dynamic. This is the difference between resonance and commitment. Resonance is immediate. It feels natural, almost effortless. Commitment is revealed over time through continuity, especially when emotional conditions are no longer ideal. So when someone mirrors your depth and then withdraws it, what follows is not just confusion, it is emotional dissonance. You are anchored to an experience that no longer matches what is actually happening, and that gap keeps people invested far longer than clarity ever would. Because they are not only relating to who the person is now, they are relating to who they once appeared to be. That becomes the hook. So the real question is not, was it real, but is it repeatable? Because anything that cannot be sustained will eventually turn into something you spend your energy trying to recreate instead of experiencing. And once that realization begins to settle, perception itself starts to shift. Because avoidant attachment patterns often carry an external image of independence that can be deeply compelling. On the surface, it looks like emotional strength, self-contained, self-directed, not overly reliant on external validation. In a world that often equates independence with emotional maturity, it can easily be interpreted as confidence. But appearance and capacity are not always the same thing. They don't over-explain themselves. There's no rush to define things, no urgency to label the connection or lock it into certainty. Instead, there's space around them, and that space creates intrigue. Because when someone doesn't fully reveal themselves, the mind doesn't stay still. It starts trying to complete the picture. This is where mystery begins. But mystery is not the same as depth. Mystery is simply missing information. Depth is consistent substance revealed over time. When information is limited, the brain doesn't wait patiently. It constructs meaning. It fills gaps, builds assumptions, and attaches interpretations to what is unclear. Silence can look like thoughtfulness. Distance becomes emotional control. Inconsistency starts to feel like complexity. And slowly, a narrative forms, not from what is present, but from what is missing. Human beings are uncomfortable with ambiguity, especially emotionally. So when clarity is absent, we resolve it internally. We create explanations, and often those explanations elevate the other person. Their independence becomes discipline. Their restraint becomes emotional strength. Their distance becomes depth. But sometimes it is simpler than the story being created. Distance is just distance, and distance gives imagination room to operate. At that point, perception begins to outweigh reality. You are no longer responding only to what is shown, but to what is hidden. And what is hidden always carries more psychological weight than what is obvious. This is why people can feel more drawn to someone they don't fully understand than someone emotionally consistent and available. Clarity reduces imagination. Ambiguity fuels it, but imagination is not the same as connection. Over time, this can shift attraction into projection, and projection replaces evidence with interpretation. You begin explaining behavior, rationalizing inconsistency, and holding onto a version of someone that exists more in your mind than in reality. This is where awareness becomes essential. The moment you separate what you know from what you assume, the illusion weakens. You stop reacting to interpretation and start observing behavior. Real connection does not require guessing. It becomes clear through consistency, presence, and alignment between words and actions. So the question changes, not why does this feel so intriguing, but what evidence do I actually have of this connection? Once you anchor in evidence, mystery stops being emotionally magnetic and becomes something you can evaluate clearly. And then a deeper layer appears, not just about the other person, but about what is being activated within you. Avoidant attachment patterns can interact with deeper emotional wiring, especially where inconsistency once existed. When someone offers just enough connection to create hope but not enough to create security, it can activate the urge to earn closeness. That urge often feels familiar. It echoes earlier experiences where connection felt conditional or unstable. So the pattern repeats: more effort, more patience, more interpretation, more waiting. It feels like hope, but often it is an old emotional loop seeking resolution. And it creates a powerful illusion that effort can stabilize inconsistency. But a dynamic built on inconsistency does not change through participation in it. Clarity becomes non-negotiable, because once you see that intensity is coming from activation, not alignment, you regain perspective. The question shifts again, not how do I make this work, but what is this revealing about me? This moves you from reaction into awareness, and at a deeper level, it asks whether you are choosing from wholeness or from unresolved emotional need. From wholeness, you are drawn to consistency and emotional availability. From need, familiarity can feel more compelling than stability, even when it hurts. But patterns are not fixed. They can be seen, and once seen, they can change. The goal is not to avoid people. It is to understand yourself so clearly that patterns no longer override perception. Because when you stop trying to resolve the past through present connections, you stop mistaking intensity for compatibility. You begin choosing differently, not based on emotional highs, but on emotional stability. And when you look at the full pattern, distance that creates desire, inconsistency that fuels attachment, ambiguity that replaces clarity, one truth becomes clear. What feels intense is not always aligned. What feels rare is not always real. Avoidant dynamics can distort perception, making inconsistency feel meaningful and emotional absence feel worth earning. But once awareness enters, everything shifts. You stop chasing what is unclear. You stop investing in what cannot consistently meet you, because real connection doesn't require decoding, chasing, or waiting. It reveals itself through presence, consistency, and emotional truth. And the final question becomes simple, not why do I feel this strongly, but what is this actually built on? Because that question brings you out of illusion and back into awareness. And awareness is where real choice begins. In the end, what you begin to realize is that not every strong feeling is a sign of something meant for you. Sometimes it is simply your nervous system responding to inconsistency, filling in gaps, and turning uncertainty into meaning. What once felt like depth slowly reveals itself as distance. What once felt like mystery turns out to be lack of clarity. And what once felt like a powerful connection often becomes a cycle of emotional highs and lows that keeps you more attached to the pattern than to the person. The real shift happens when you stop measuring connection by intensity and start measuring it by consistency. Because true emotional security is not found in moments that spike your feelings, but in presence that remains steady even when emotions are not at their peak. At that point, something important changes. You stop chasing what feels familiar but unstable, and you start recognizing what feels calm but real. You no longer confuse emotional activation with love. You begin to see it for what it is, activation, not alignment. And when that awareness settles in, the cycle loses its power. You are no longer pulled by unpredictability or driven by the need to decode someone's behavior. Instead, you return to yourself, to clarity, to emotional truth, because the strongest connection you will ever build is not the one that keeps you guessing, it is the one that keeps you grounded.